You are standing at the edge of a lake that should not exist. It sits above the tree line. No river runs into it. No road ever reached it until a trail was cut a century later. The water is so clear you can count the stones on the bottom. And swimming through that water, slow and unbothered, are fish. Real fish. Breeding, feeding, dying, and being born again. You look around. There is no ocean nearby. No stream connects this lake to anything else alive. So you ask the obvious question, how did they get here? The easy answer is that someone put them there. And sometimes, that is exactly what happened. But the real answer is far stranger. Because long before humans carried buckets of trout up mountain trails, fish were already finding their way into places that seem, on paper, completely impossible to reach. Your instinct says fish need a river, a connected path, a way in. But nature has spent millions of years proving that instinct wrong. Start with the water itself. A mountain lake feels permanent, fixed, like it has always been exactly where it is, exactly how it looks now. It is not. 10,000 years ago, much of that same landscape was buried under ice. Glaciers a kilometer thick pressed down on valleys, carving out basins as they moved. When the ice finally retreated, it left behind bowls of bare rock. Rain filled some. Snowmelt filled others. And for a while, these new lakes were empty. Sterile. Nothing living in them at all. But empty does not mean isolated forever. As the glaciers melted, they did not vanish neatly. They left behind temporary rivers of meltwater, connecting basin to basin, lake to lake, valley to valley, in a way that would look completely different from the landscape you see today. For a window of time, sometimes just decades, sometimes centuries, a fish could swim from a lowland river, through a temporary channel, into what is now a landlocked alpine lake with no visible outlet at all. That channel is long gone, but the fish it left behind never left. This is where a researcher named Dolph Schluter changed how scientists think about these isolated populations. Schluter, an evolutionary biologist, spent decades studying stickleback fish in lakes that formed after glacial retreat in Western Canada. What he found was remarkable. Populations of the same species, stranded in different lakes at the same moment in geological history, evolved differently, depending on what each lake demanded of them. Some grew bigger. Some grew smaller. Some developed different feeding structures entirely. All from the same ancestral population, split apart the instant their glacial connection disappeared. In other words, the lake was not empty rock waiting for fish to be added later. The fish arrived at the exact moment the door was still open, and then the door closed behind them. Pause on that for a second. You are looking at evolution frozen mid-sentence, a population cut off before it finished becoming anything in particular, left to keep becoming something on its own, alone, for 10,000 years. Now widen the picture. Glacial meltwater did not just connect lakes gently, the way a canal connects two ponds. Sometimes it happened violently. Ice dams formed where a glacier blocked a valley, holding back enormous volumes of water behind a wall of ice. When that dam finally failed, and eventually it always failed, the result was not a stream. It was a flood, sometimes carrying more water in a single day than a normal river carries in a year. These catastrophic floods scoured out new channels in hours, connecting basins that had never touched before, and carrying fish, sediment, and entire slabs of the ecosystem with them. A lake 50 kilometers from the nearest river today might once have been directly in the path of one of these floods, receiving its founding population of fish in a single violent afternoon rather than a slow migration. Geologists studying the Missoula floods in North America and similar catastrophic drainage events in the Alps and the Himalayas have mapped exactly this kind of sudden, short-lived connectivity. The lake you are standing beside might carry the genetic fingerprint of a flood that lasted less than a week, 10,000 years ago, and never happened again. But glacial connection, gentle or catastrophic, only explains some of these lakes. Plenty of alpine lakes were never touched by a meltwater channel. Plenty sit at elevations where no river, ancient or modern, could plausibly have reached. And yet, fish are there too. So how? The answer involves something you have probably never thought about. Fish eggs are sticky, not slightly sticky, genuinely structurally adhesive. Many species coat their eggs in a mucus layer specifically so they will cling to whatever they touch: rocks, plants, gravel. It keeps the eggs anchored in moving water so they do not simply wash away before hatching. That stickiness has a side effect nobody designed for. It means fish eggs can attach themselves to things that move, things like the legs and feathers of water birds. A duck lands in a lowland pond to feed. It stirs up sediment, disturbs plants, wades through shallow water where fish have recently spawned. Eggs attach to its feet, its feathers, the mud caked along its belly. The duck takes off. It flies because that is what ducks do, sometimes for enormous distances, sometimes over mountain ranges, chasing weather patterns or migration routes that have nothing to do with the fish riding along uninvited. Hours later, that duck lands on a completely different body of water. A remote one with no river connection to anywhere. It shakes itself off, preens, wades in, and the eggs, still viable, slip free into a lake they have absolutely no evolutionary business being in. Researchers Andy Green and Jordi Figueroa have spent years documenting exactly this mechanism, what scientists call bird-mediated dispersal, or more technically, epizoochory. Their work shows that aquatic organisms, not just fish eggs but invertebrates, plant seeds, even small crustaceans, regularly hitch rides on the bodies of water birds across distances that would otherwise be impassable. It is not a rare fluke. It is a quiet, ongoing, almost invisible process that has been reshuffling isolated water bodies for as long as birds have been flying between them. Think about what that means. Every remote lake with an unexplained fish population is not necessarily a mystery. It might just be the record of one duck, one lucky flight path, one accidental cargo of eggs, decades or centuries ago. You have probably never considered a duck as a vehicle for evolution, but it is one of the most reliable ones nature has. There is an even stranger version of this same idea, one that does not involve birds at all. Some fish species have eggs so resilient they can survive passing through an animal's digestive system entirely intact. Waterfowl that eat fish eggs directly, rather than simply carrying them externally, sometimes excrete a small percentage still capable of hatching, deposited wherever that bird happens to land next. It sounds almost too strange to be true. An egg surviving a trip through a stomach and emerging ready to become a fish. But controlled studies feeding fish eggs to captive waterfowl have confirmed viable hatching afterward. Nature does not care how undignified the journey is, only whether it works. Still, not every high mountain lake got its fish this way either. Some got them far more directly. From you, or rather, from people very much like you, a few generations back. But before you picture a modern fisheries officer with a truck full of tanks, understand that humans have been moving fish into isolated water for far longer than that. Long before any government agency existed, communities living near mountain lakes were already carrying fish upward on purpose. In parts of the Himalayas and the Andes, oral histories describe fish being carried in wet cloth or hollowed gourds, released into high lakes as a deliberate act, sometimes tied to ritual, sometimes simply as a practical way to create a future food source close to a seasonal camp. Archaeological evidence from alpine regions in Europe has turned up fish bones in lake sediments, dating back further than any official stocking record, in lakes with no natural connection to fish-bearing water. Someone carried them there, on foot, centuries before anyone wrote it down. The lake did not remember who. It only remembered that they arrived. This matters because it complicates the tidy story of untouched wilderness. You look at a remote alpine lake, and your instinct is to treat it as the most natural, least human-influenced place you could stand. And in some cases, that is true. But in others, what looks like pure wilderness is actually one of the oldest ongoing collaborations between people and landscape. So old that the human fingerprint has been mistaken for nature itself. Here is where the story takes its counterintuitive twist. For most of human history, alpine lakes above a certain elevation were naturally fishless. Too cold, too isolated, too disconnected from any spawning route. Amphibians thrived there instead. Frogs and salamanders that had the entire lake to themselves, with no predator hunting their eggs and larvae from below the surface. Insects filled the water column undisturbed. The whole system had evolved for thousands of years around the simple fact that nothing swam there. Then, starting in the late 1800s and accelerating through the 20th century, fisheries agencies in mountain regions around the world began deliberately stocking these lakes. The goal was simple. People wanted to fish in beautiful places. Recreational anglers wanted trout in every accessible alpine basin. So agencies packed fingerlings into milk cans, loaded them onto mules, and hauled them up switchback trails to lakes that had never held a fish in their entire existence. Later, some agencies switched to airplanes, literally dropping young fish from the sky into lakes too remote for any trail at all, a practice still used in parts of the western United States today. It worked. Almost. Too well. Trout are efficient predators. In a lake with no evolutionary history of fish at all, native amphibians had no defenses prepared. Ecologist Roland Ganap spent years studying Sierra Nevada lakes in California, where trout had been introduced, and documented a stark pattern. Lakes with stocked trout showed dramatic, sometimes near-total collapses in native frog populations. The frogs simply had not evolved any strategy for a predator that eats eggs and tadpoles directly out of open water. Knapp's research became part of the evidence that eventually led wildlife agencies to stop stocking many of these high lakes, and in some cases, to actively remove the fish that had been placed there decades earlier, sometimes using nets, sometimes using targeted chemical treatments, all in an attempt to undo a decision made by someone who never imagined the consequences would still be unfolding 100 years later. What makes this even more striking is how quickly the balance shifted once the trout were gone. In lakes where fish were removed, some frog populations rebounded within a handful of years, suggesting the amphibians had never truly forgotten how to thrive there. The absence of fish was not a permanent condition being restored. It was the original condition, briefly interrupted by a human decision, and now being handed back. You might wonder how scientists even tell these stories apart, given that a lake does not come with a label explaining its own history. The answer lives inside the fish themselves. Genetic analysis can compare a lake's fish population to nearby rivers and other lakes, looking for how closely related they are and how long ago their lineages split. A population that diverged genetically 10,000 years ago points toward glacial-era colonization. A population that is genetically almost identical to a hatchery strain used decades ago points toward deliberate stocking, often confirmed by matching it directly against historical fisheries. Records that list exactly which lakes were seeded and when. Isotope analysis of fish bones pulled from lake sediment cores can even estimate age directly, letting researchers date the very first fish that ever lived in a given lake, sometimes to within a few decades. What looks to you like an ordinary swimming fish is, to a geneticist, a kind of biological archive, quietly recording exactly how and when it arrived. So now you have several very different stories sitting inside the same landscape. One lake got its fish from a departed glacier 10,000 years ago, evolving quietly and undisturbed ever since. Another got its fish from a single catastrophic flood that lasted less than a week. A third got its fish from a duck's muddy feet sometime in the last few centuries. And the lake next to all of them got its fish from a canvas sack on a mule's back, or a bucket dropped from an airplane, sometime around 1930 or 1960, and the ecosystem is still adjusting to that decision. From the shore, they all look identical: clear water, circling fish, no visible history at all. That is the part that should unsettle you a little. Every lake you have ever looked at, mountain or otherwise, is carrying a story you cannot see just by looking. Some are geological. Some are biological accidents involving a bird's muddy feet, or worse, a bird's digestive tract. Some are the direct, deliberate result of a decision made by people who wanted better fishing and never imagined the downstream consequences a century later. And this is not only about lakes. Think about how much of what surrounds you right now arrived by a path you never questioned. The plant on your windowsill has ancestors that crossed oceans, sometimes deliberately, sometimes by accident, tucked into the folds of a merchant ship or clinging to the boots of a traveler. The bacteria in your gut trace back to populations that moved with your ancestors across continents you have never visited. Even the language forming in your head right now arrived through centuries of contact, conquest, trade, and accident, layered on top of each other so thoroughly that untangling any single thread feels almost impossible. You experience the world as a finished, static thing, a mountain lake that has simply always looked this way, a landscape that arrived complete. But almost nothing around you got here in a straight line. Everything alive near you followed some improbable, accidental, occasionally engineered route to end up exactly where it is, at exactly the moment you happen to be looking at it. Consider your own life for a moment through the same lens. The habits you carry, the fears that surface without warning, the tastes you never chose but somehow have anyway. Very little of it arrived through a single deliberate decision. Most of it slipped in sideways, attached to something else entirely, the emotional equivalent of a fish egg riding on a duck's foot. A comment someone made once, a pattern absorbed from watching people around you before you were old enough to question it. You did not choose most of what shaped you any more than that lake chose its fish. You simply happened to be in the path of something that was moving anyway. There is a reason this idea keeps circling back to you personally, rather than staying safely out there in the water. Every ecosystem you study closely eventually turns into a mirror, whether the scientist intended that or not. You wanted to know how fish got into a lake. What you actually found was a set of mechanisms, chance, catastrophe, quiet biological hitchhiking, and deliberate human intention that describe almost everything that has ever entered your own life, too. Some things arrived because a door was briefly open, the way that glacial channel was briefly open, and you happened to be moving through it at the right moment. Some things arrived attached to something else, unnoticed, the way an egg arrives attached to a feather. Some things were carried in on purpose, by someone who wanted a particular outcome and never checked back to see what else had changed. And once any of it settled in, it started evolving on its own terms, shaped by conditions nobody controls after the initial arrival. The fish in that lake did not know they were making evolutionary history when a glacier stranded them. The duck did not know it was seeding an ecosystem when it shook mud off its feathers. The person hauling milk cans up a mountain trail in 1930 did not know they were rewriting the fate of an amphibian population that had survived undisturbed for millions of years. None of them were thinking about permanence. They were just moving, just living, just doing the next small thing in front of them. And yet, permanence is exactly what they created, whether they meant to or not. So the next time you find something in a place that seems to make no sense, a plant somewhere it should not grow, an animal somewhere it should not survive, even a habit or a memory lodged somewhere in your own life that seems to have no clear origin, remember the lake. Nothing arrives by accident, even when it looks like one. And nothing that arrives stays untouched by the journey it took to get there. You are standing at the edge of a lake that should not exist. Except now you know it does exist, for reasons that are ancient, accidental, and human, all layered on top of each other in water so clear you can see straight to the bottom and still not see the whole story at all.